I'm Thomas Mills with Politics NC, and today we have Hometown Heroes, and our guest is Robert Reives, the minority leader in the North Carolina House. I want to give a brief disclaimer as we get started. I've known Robert for a very long time. I worked on his early campaigns, and I'm a big fan. If you're looking for something that's nonpartisan, you might as well turn it off now, because I'm a Leader Reives person. But Robert, I really appreciate you taking time today to be here, and I want to jump into this a little bit. So thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Tom. It's always good to see you.
Good to see you. So let's start with the budget. We're in the end of October, and we still don't have a budget here. We were told that Republicans have veto-proof majorities, basically, or functioning veto-proof majorities in both houses. And yet, what's going on? I mean, why don't we have a budget? Can you give us a little background on that?
Yeah, Thomas, and it's interesting because when you talk to the average voter in these circumstances, I think a lot of times people don't understand what that control means. So they hear the word supermajority or superminority, and I don't think it really tells them, okay, this is what it means for you. So in simple parlance, it's simply this. You got to have 61 votes to pass a budget in the House. You got to have 72 votes to override any veto. And so according to Republicans, and in the Senate, percentage-wise, same numbers. So if you're passing a budget, you've got to get it through the House, you got to get it through the Senate, and then if there's a veto by the governor, you got to be able to override that. According to Republicans, what they've said since 2 months before we went into session, as soon as the elections were over, is that they have the ability to do this. So that means they literally do not have to have a conversation with Democrats at any point in time to get a budget passed. They don't have to acknowledge the governor. They don't have to acknowledge most of the Democrats. They've just got to get one Democrat to flip in the House, and that's it. And they state that they have that. So when it comes down to it, the only job we have in legislatures, and it's really the same thing with federal Congress, your job is actually just to pass a budget. Like if we walk in, pass a budget, and walk out, we have done our jobs. Nobody can say, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that. You can always argue about the spending, but the budget is no issue. In North Carolina, we have a continuing resolution, which means some basic things will be taken care of, even if we haven't passed the budget. And the reason I bring that up is because that makes your job even easier. So when you talk about computer simulations and all of the staff that we've got hundreds of people that their only job is to help us comprise a budget. You really ought to know the budget and what you're going to do with the budget by about February or March. And from March to May, you should just be tweaking the budget. By June, you ought to have a budget passed. You should have run all your committees. And it's a pretty simple process if you've got complete control. What has not happened since Republicans have taken over in 2010 is that pretty simple process. The larger the numbers have got, the harder it's become. Now, one of the reasons that it was problematic, I've served for 11 years, since 2014. And I would say up until last cycle, the big problem they had there is all these pet projects or port projects, as you would hear. So we got up to a point where the last budget that was passed had about $2 billion in port projects. To give you some perspective, you could have made that same discussion about budgets back in 2011, 2012, when Republicans took over. You might have had 200 million. And so that has become a big problem. And the other big problem is, they're not affected. And that's really what it gets down to is we've centralized power so that really 4 years ago, for instance, that budget was written by about 4 people out of the 170 that serve. And you've had too much of that going on. So if you've only got 4 or 5 people writing the budget, you've got access to hundreds of people to help you write the budget. You've got all of this other time and all of these other examples of what a budget looks like. For example, the governor's able to give us a budget by March. Then you really ought to be able to have a budget if that's what you want. If you don't really care about having a budget, then that's how we end up where we are right now. And so you end up seeing the budget fight be about everything but what's in the budget. And I won't speculate on what it is. I think a lot of us in the building have a good feeling as to why we don't have a budget, but it has nothing to do with disagreements about, maybe we should spend $400 million on early education instead of 300 million. It's got to do with, personal desires of some of the people who are affecting the writing of the budget.
Pork projects, basically. Is that what you're saying?
Well, pork projects are part of it. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So really what you're telling me is that we have a group of Republicans who can't govern. If their job, as you put it, is to pass a budget and they haven't done it, then they're really not governing. They're not doing the basics. Is that right?
I mean, that's correct because, again, they've got single party control in North Carolina right now. They've got the courts, they've got the General Assembly. They've given a lot of the gubernatorial power either to the legislature itself or to the state auditor. So everybody that's in a Democratic position is null and void. They can actually do anything they want right now and get it done, which is the other reason that, it gets so frustrating when we keep coming back to session for all these cultural war projects, and all these kind of things that are just meant to get people ticked off because they always they always nickel and dime it, which I find funny. They've got the ability, if there's something they want gone, they can just eradicate it because the courts aren't going to overturn it, not the state courts. They don't have anybody to buck them in the legislature, but they nickel and dime these things because they want to keep people on the hook. So today, we'll tackle culture war issue number one, but we're just going to tackle one of 10 parts of it because we want people to think that we're fighting hard for them on this issue. Next time we'll come back and do something else. And all they're doing is distracting you from the fact that they can't pass a budget. And they've got single party control. If you can't pass a budget when you're the only party in control, then by definition, you can't govern. Because if I can tell you right now, if we were in control, budget's done. And the budget's done not because we're smarter or because we're better, because ultimately we know one thing. There's going to have to be compromise even within your party to get things done. That's what governing is. That's why you have people representing different areas. So all of those voices can be heard.
So the fight here is really between Republicans. It's not
Yes.
between
And specifically
Republicans and the
between,
governor. It's not I mean, historically the fight has been between the legislature and the governor. But what we've got here is an intramural dispute between people within the same party, but just in different houses of the legislature, right?
yeah, it's just between the leaders of the two chambers. It's the president pro tem and the speaker of the house. President pro tem and the speaker of the house come to an agreement, and there's nothing else to discuss. They are literally the two most powerful people in the state. They're literally the people who can end this today. They could walk in a room today and say, okay, this is what we're going to do. They can walk out of that room and they're not going to have to fight the other members of their chamber. The other members of their chamber are going to do what they tell them to do, and that'll be it. And so if two people decide that they want a budget, they have a budget.
So you said that one of the things that makes it easy is the continuing resolution. What does the continuing resolution do exactly? I mean, does it?
Well, a continuing resolution makes sure that basic functions of government keep going, and it could actually be meatier. So, for instance, what we could do if we were really serious about governing in the continuing resolution is not just make sure that the bare bones happen, but to go ahead and put raises in there. So, for instance, saying that automatically every year there's an X amount of raise. If we don't come to an agreement, it goes into effect July 1st. We could automatically say, instead of making non-recurring money, in some of these areas, that you've got recurring money. So you could actually make a very meaty continuing resolution that would make it easier on people when we do things like this. But purposefully, that continuing resolution is bare bones so that government doesn't completely shut down, but it's enough that it really gets people uneasy. And what it does is it gets people used to scarcity. And what I mean by that is this, is by the time we do a budget, people are going to be so desperate for money that the 10% request for a raise is going to go down to 5%. The 3% request for a COLA is going to go down to we'll take a bonus. Teacher money, we'll take whatever you can get. By the time we pass a budget, they're going to be depending on people having been strained and struck so badly that they'll take anything that we give them. And that's on purpose. Because again, we could put anything we want into that continuing resolution, but what we've done is just barely enough so that government can keep working.
So the difference between the federal government is they cause a lot of pain when they can't get a budget resolution, and what we've done really is delayed the pain. I mean, it seems to me that if government in North Carolina shut down, it puts pressure on the legislature to get something done pretty quickly
Exactly.
because it could
Exactly.
start to have political consequences. But as long as they can
Exactly.
kind of kick the ball down the road, you're really rewarding the people who don't want government to function.
Right.
There's a contingent in the Republican Party that believes that government can't do anything right. So they don't want to have much government. So they're probably fine with living off of these continuing resolutions. Am I not right?
Well, the thing is, I would say even more specifically, you've got a contingent that tells people that they don't like government and they don't like it, but it's amazing how many of them have jobs and grants that come from government. But that's a
Right.
different story. So what they do is they continue to beat that drum that government doesn't work, government isn't helping you, government didn't do anything, because the more you get that mindset, then the more comfortable you are when their best friend gets the $50 million project, and when their kid is able to get the $150,000 job, and when their person is able to get this appointment that's a lucrative appointment that decides how money is going to get spent on roads and on buildings and things of that sort. So again, it's hiding the ball. They tell people to feel this and they beat into people's heads, government's bad, government's bad. But I'll say it's just like this. If you go in and your doctor tells you, Thomas, if you eat 1 more ounce of sugar, 1 more gram of sugar, you're going to die, then you stop eating sugar. There's nothing else to talk about. So if government's so bad, why are so many of them taking advantage of government? Why are so many of them taking these jobs, taking these grants, taking these monies, making sure that they control every inch of government, putting their people on trustees boards and all this kind of thing? But they will look you in the face and tell you you should hate government and that this is an example why government's not working. It's a distraction is all it is and all it's ever been. And I think that what your hope is if you're in that contingent, is that the folks that you are hiding the ball from and the folks that you're putting the shell game with don't get together with the other folks that you're telling them are demonized and get together and say, oh, wait a minute, we're all in the same boat. These are the guys that are screwing us and making things bad for us. Why don't we start talking and figure out how to get these guys out of office? Because ultimately what's happened in this country and in this state is an economic war, and the only thing that they can do to continue the economic war is to keep the non-haves, the don't haves, fighting with each other and thinking, oh, if I can get rid of this group, then suddenly I'm going to have. And the problem is the haves are the ones that are putting you here, and they're the ones getting the government handout. See Elon Musk with $7.23 billion worth of government money is coming to him.
Right. So is there a way to put political pressure on the Republicans? I mean, I feel like not enough North Carolinians understand that we don't have a budget yet. And even if they do understand, a lot of them don't care. It would be nice to be able to put some sort of political pressure on them. Do you know, is there any way to do that? Is there any way to raise the profile of the fact that these guys aren't doing their jobs?
You got to show people where they're getting hurt, because that's the other problem is we've stopped teaching civics. And I know that sounds kind of a quaint way of saying it, but the truth is people don't understand how government works. And it's not sexy to explain to people how government works, but that's where we are failing as communities. As a community, what you've got to be able to do is sit down in your church, in your civic organization. You've got to say, we've got to have a day where we just talk about how we have been hurt by what's going on right now. These are the things we can't do because the government won't do their basics. Like, think of all the gaps that we fill in with nonprofits, where the government should be helping us with childcare. We've got nonprofit staff to do it. I go to Mecklenburg, for instance, all the time, being, the banking capital of the world and being obviously our largest county. And you go down to Mecklenburg, and I'm talking to businesses that are putting millions of dollars into their school system, not, for altruistic reasons, obviously, but also a recognition that we've got to invest in this because these guys are going to be the people that are going to be taking care of us as we get older. These are the people who are going to be working our government jobs. These are the people who are going to be our next scientists and our next doctors, things of that sort. And they got to have some basics in order to be able to get there. If they get to college and they're getting remediation, then they're wasting their 4 years of college. And college is becoming more expensive on purpose. To put political pressure on them is just like raising a child. And we are the children of the state. the elected officials. If you keep rewarding bad behavior, you're going to get bad behavior. So if it becomes more important to you to have somebody stand up, just like a tweet that went out today and say, we're going to go after Orange County schools and we're going to make those Orange County schools explain to us why they said certain words that we don't want you saying. If we reward that behavior and say, yeah, that's what we want you doing right now, instead of saying, look, man, if you go over to Orange County, you still haven't passed a budget, we're voting you out of office. That's
Right.
what you've got to do. The other thing you've got to do is put economic pressure on them. And that's something that we don't do as a community often enough, because there are people who fund them, who fund their lifestyles, who fund their ability to get elected. If you start putting economic pressure on those people, if you go to your local mom and pop store and say, hey, I love doing business with Smith and Company. I think you guys are great. You guys have served our community and served our family for the last 3 generations. But you have made a decision that you want to support people who are going to make it harder for me to ever advance and make it harder for my children to have a better life. I can't continue to give you money so that you can give money to those people. So, I mean, are there ways to put political pressure? Absolutely. Do we choose to do that? Unfortunately, no. What we do is we spend a lot of time with circular firing squads, getting mad at people within our own groups, within our own communities, people who cannot affect what's going on and complain about them. Or we take the time-honored stance of, you know what? I'm not supporting anybody because everybody's bad. Well, then all that does is continue to encourage the bad behavior.
Right. That unfortunately, that's a kind of cynical reality, isn't it? That people
Yes.
would rather walk away from politics than to engage and try to fix it because they feel like it's so bad. Well, let me shift gears just a minute because another thing happened while you guys were not passing a budget. You redistricted.
Yes.
North Carolina is a state that has had to redistrict a whole lot in the middle of the decade, but always because the court said we had to, always as a
Right.
result of a lawsuit. The Constitution, the state constitution says that you can only redistrict legislative seats, state house and state senate seats, right after the census, the decennial census, right? But it doesn't throw the congressional seats in there. And Republicans noticed that omission and decided to do it on their own without pressure from the courts. They just did it after Donald Trump asked them to, right? Is that pretty much
Yes.
what happened? Can
What
you
it
tell
said
me
on the
what
floor.
happened? Tell me about those districts. What did they do?
Well, what it is and it's interesting because one of the people who serves in the Northeast, Greg Murphy, is upset about it. And again, he's a Republican. And that's part of what I warned about in our debate is that they're going to screw over everybody at some point. There's this group that's in leadership and they're just going to take care of themselves and they don't care about how loyal you've been or how good you've been or how good a Republican you've been. You're going to get it too. So what they did in this particular case is they decided they needed one more seat, and the untruth that continued to get told is that somehow this is a reaction to a Democratic state. This starts in Texas. That's factually correct. And there was a world where it used to be media would say, as soon as you say something was factually incorrect, say, no, this is actually the timeline. But, again, that's why Jeff Bezos buys the Washington Post. That's why the billionaire that bought the LA Times buys that. That's why the New York Times is bought. That's why Murdoch buys Wall Street Journal, is so that you don't have anybody to challenge those truths. Texas starts it at the request of the president. California responds. And then I think it was Missouri that then responds. And so you still end up with a net one for Republican congressional seats against what any norms have been. In North Carolina, we have never in our history done any mid-cycle redistricting except for by court order. Ever. Every time we've done it has been as a response of a court order. So we decided this time we're going to do that. And what it was done in was in the Northeast is, I think it's a terrible term, but it's called the Black Belt. And it's because you got a large sampling of African Americans that live in the Northeastern corridor. And, for the last, 60 years, they've always been represented by an African American. And that's kind of always been and understood. It's kind of been one of those things, not a concession made that had to be carved out. That's actually, if the votes fall naturally, if districting is done naturally, that's what's going to happen. So they decide to take that seat. And some people are going to look at that as the taking of a seat because Don Davis was an African American. I think it's worse than that. What it is Don Davis was one of the few congressional people that stood up. And Don's been famously bipartisan, famously easy to work with on both sides. But Don said, yeah, this bill that you guys are touting is going to kill us in the Northeast. We can't function without government infrastructure like Medicaid and healthcare, things of that sort. We can't do it. And so he voted against it, and that was the death nail. From that point, they've decided they want to get rid of him. This gave them the opportunity, and so they got rid of that seat.
On another podcast that I do, Restless Natives, Travis Fain made the point that in these redistricting wars, the casualties are the moderates, the people who tend to work across
Yes.
the aisle, because those are
Yes.
the districts that they can get. They can
Yes.
shift a handful of voters here or a handful of voters there and make them hyper partisan districts when they were competitive districts. And it bothers me watching what's happening going across the country, because Democrats made a huge naive error nationally. We spent the 2000s and the 2000s pushing for nonpartisan redistricting committees. And that's what California's trying to undo now, because
Mhm.
we thought that the movement was towards a more democratic society. And Republicans took the exact opposite tact. As we were pushing for these nonpartisan redistricting committees in places like New York and California that were reliably Democratic, Republicans were pushing for extreme gerrymandering using new technology and tools to squeeze out as many seats as they could get. I mean, North
Mhm.
Carolina, when they first got control, went from basically we had it was always, you know, we had 13 seats for a long time, and it was always like 7-6. It might get to be, 8-5, but there were always a bunch of competitive races. Now there are
Mhm.
no competitive races. If they
Right.
if they had 6 competitive seats and they ended up with an 11-3 majority like it looks like they're probably gonna end up with, it's hard to argue with it. The problem is
Mhm.
they're not even competitive. And the way we work today, you don't even spend money. You don't campaign. People don't hear what folks stand for when you don't have a competitive race, because
Right.
there's no money to campaign. And so it really, really has winnowed down democracy nationally. And I think Democrats, again, made a huge strategic error believing naively that we were moving more towards a more democratic society, when in reality, Republicans saw the exact opposite. We were in the throes of believing that we were moving towards the election of Obama, kind of a post-racial America that was going to be a positive thing, that people were going to get equal chances. Instead, the Republicans saw it as a backlash, and they really made it difficult for us to have a democracy. I mean, Travis disagrees, but in my reading of what's going on, we've essentially ended democracy in congressional races in North Carolina, because the outcome is almost predetermined. It would take a huge wave for Democrats to pick up congressional seats in this state. And if that's not anti democratic, I don't know what is.
Yeah. And I'd say I agree with you, Thomas. It is. And I think the big problem is not just the view that we were going, we were moving towards a non-democratic or a more democratic society. I think the big problem was understanding just how hard the fight back would be and just how hard the backlash would be. It took us, in my opinion, Obama gets elected in '08, starts serving in '09. It took us till 2015 before we would utter the word race. And that's silly. And, acknowledging that race is a problem isn't calling other people racist. It isn't talking about anything else except for acknowledging that that is a weapon that is being used. That's been used since America was born. Is that, how can we easily separate people? It was funny. I was at an educational forum And they were talking about all these other countries that have kind of solved the education problem because all these other countries recognize nobody is hurt if every single person we've got is as educated as they possibly can be. But America is the opposite. America puts in billions of dollars to stop people from getting educated. They spend billions of dollars to make people not want education, to make people believe education is bad. And the simple reason is because in America, it's much easier to separate us into groups. And it's much easier to get somebody to say, look, man, the reason that you can't get a job that's paying you more than 7.45 an hour is that group over there that's making 7.45 an hour. They're taking all your good jobs. Instead of being able to understand the concept of you've got a group of people that are running your government that are doing everything they can to make sure that you don't get the tools that you need to advance and that your kids don't get the tools they need to advance. So going back to your point about redistricting, what they don't understand is this redistricting is being done because and that the reason they want to have these hyper partisan races is just what you just said, is to make people give up hope and to feel like, well, we're never going to change this anyway, and just react with emotion instead of reacting with, we need to coalesce, we've got to figure out how to break this. Like when Citizens United was done, nobody to this day understands why that was bad. John Roberts does. John Roberts knows exactly what he was doing. He's known exactly what he's done with the Supreme Court. He is smiled as a moderate as he's sat here and he's tried to make this the most draconian country in the history of democracies, a
Right.
bloodless revolution. And what he knew was, the minute I can make corporations be able to put ungodly amounts of money into government, we will own these people. There will never be any kind of change because ultimately these billionaires, the bad bit, and that's not, every billionaire is not bad, and every person that's got money isn't bad. But the people who have bad intentions recognize two things, which is why Elon Musk bought Twitter, why the president has pushed for one of his friends to be able to buy TikTok. They understand that if I pepper you from all sides, if I spend billions of dollars to make you give up, if I spend billions of dollars to make you hate, that by the time you get to voting, you're never going to spend time voting because you're going to think there's no way government can fix this. And so you get more extreme people to argue more extreme positions. You make moderates say, you know what, it's not worth it being here. And the next thing you know, you've got a government full of people who are the most extreme versions of our politics, not just that we have right now, but that we have ever had. People that are in office right now, leading legislatures, leading Congress, would not have survived in 1990. In 1990, not only would they have lost office, but they would have been banned from running for office again. Now they're encouraged. Now, you get Marjorie Taylor Greene. I'm surprised she hasn't hasn't been nominated for vice president on a ticket
Right.
because she's become that popular.
Right. You were talking a little bit about, we did mention race in the 2000, during the Obama years, that type of thing. One thing that has struck me is when I grew up, we used to talk about a melting pot where America was a place where everybody could come together. And we don't hear that term anymore. Because people don't there's a segment of society that doesn't want a melting pot. And maybe there may be some on both sides a little bit. But I think there's a moderate group that probably still wants that. The idea, the hope that we can all kind of blend together and be equal. And I would like to figure out, how do you get back to that concept? It's never going to be perfect, but it can certainly be better than segmenting out and demonizing different groups, because that's really, really been destructive.
Yeah, and I think, Thomas, you and I had a chance to grow up, and I know we're close enough in age that I had a fully integrated school experience. And so, my parents didn't get that. Nobody else got that. My aunt was actually the first one in the entire family. She's the baby girl on my mom's side to actually even go to a high school that was integrated. And, she got moved into Greenwood High. And so what happened is you had a group of us who grew up in a sweet spot. I mean, you think about it then, music melded together, people melded together. You suddenly had more interracial relationships, not romantic relationships, but friendships. You had people, who were having sleepovers, who had kids over that their parents, at that age didn't even know those people existed within their community. And so that was a good time. But again, what that also did is it then raised the consciousness of people to recognize we actually had the power. You suddenly had a group of people who, especially those that came out of the 60s and 70s, that realized that the richest guy in the world could not do anything to nullify the power of your vote, but nullify the power of your push and your sense of community. So what they recognize is we've got to destroy that. And so what we've got to start doing is twofold. And you said it briefly, but you got to reemphasize that's a problem on both sides of our aisle, and it's weaponized in different ways on both sides of our aisle. And you still have to get people. We mean that if we believe that the ultimate good is good community, good economic opportunity, and to support each other. If we believe truly in not just Christian values, the same values that Muslims have, Christians have, Hindus have. See, everybody's got the same value that we're better off if we support each other as a community. If we're serious about that, we've got to vote like that. And what we do is we've stopped voting like that. Like you'll allow your line no longer is the racism. Your line now is something that is personal to you. So it used to be there'd be a point where you'd say, when, for instance, you and I remember when David Duke ran,
Yeah.
there was a line and he was across that line. But I don't know that he'd be across that line today.
No, I don't
You
think he
have it
would.
within our party when you have people who, and it gets delicate on the Democratic side. I will just say there are arguments that are made on the Democratic side about the placement of minority groups on the Democratic side and how serious we are being supportive of them. We've got to make efforts. You can't go and say that the other side needs to do things that you're not willing to do. So, if I'm saying the other side is bad because they don't have Robert Reeves doing a podcast, I can't then turn around and not have Robert Reeves on my side do a podcast, for instance. And we don't recognize what that does in minority groups. Like I like to, in all aspects of my life, try to be engaging with everybody. So for instance, I know that just using my law firm as an example, when I didn't have to, I wanted to make sure that law firm reflected the community I served. I didn't want anybody to come in and feel uncomfortable, not because I knew I would treat them differently, but because I felt that was important. I felt representation was important. I want you to walk in, and whatever walk of life you came from, I want you to walk in looking at law firm and see somebody that you knew that you could be in church with, be in a community group with. And we've truly got to be that on the Democratic side. But because of these, the hyperpartisanism, we've gotten worse than we were. We've gotten to a point where we look at people who don't think like us as problematic, whereas we used to look at people who don't think like us as people that we could bring in, talk to, and convert to a more open and loving mindset.
And that dovetails nicely into what I kind of our final topic. And back to what you said, you and I grew up in small towns. My first grade class was the first integrated class that went all the way through. So I'm a little bit older than you, but North Carolina integrated. It's not all counties integrated exactly the same time. There was a process there, but it was basically the
Hmm.
same time. It was a period, and I think that was a sweet spot because today, I have friends. I still keep up with those friends from those schools, and some of them are black, some of them are white. Whereas, a generation before that, it would have been a much more segregated group. But in doing that,
Absolutely.
and growing up in small towns and in rural communities, one of the advantages is you did get to know everybody, particularly in the wake of integration. You knew people of all backgrounds and you got to know them as people. And I feel like part of what's happened right now is as a society, we've moved into these bubbles. And the advantage of growing up in a small town and knowing people is you knew people you didn't always agree with everybody, but you didn't turn them into people you hated. They weren't people to be enemies. And I
Hmm.
think you see it on both sides of the aisle. I think that Democrats, as they become much more of an urban suburban party, they don't really understand small. town and rural culture. And I think you have the same thing on the Republican side where, in fact, I just wrote a piece where a conservative posted something about, well, we can't trust those people because they weren't born and raised in North Carolina. So, you have it on both sides. There's a lack of trust, but it's more than just a lack of trust. It's a lack of understanding.
Yeah.
And I don't care as much about the Republicans because I can't influence them very much. But I do care about the Democrats. And I look at people like you who you grew up in Sanford. I grew up in Wadesboro. And I look at people, leaders like Roy Cooper, who grew up in Rocky Mount. And I think the reason Roy's been successful, you've been successful to some degree is your ability to cross lines because you're able to see these people not as your enemies or bad people. They're people who share a community with you with whom you disagree. And that's not a bad thing. That's America. And we've
Yeah.
gotten so far into these bubbles that we no longer are trying to find consensus to come to agreement. We're trying to win. We're trying to bulldoze one side or the other. And I wonder what Democrats can do, particularly urban and suburban Democrats, and most especially urban suburban Democrats who didn't grow up in North Carolina. What can we do to better understand and reach out to these rural communities? Because I'm going to tell you, regardless of what some people want to say, Democrats cannot become a, a majority party. North Carolina cannot become a bluer state if we can't cut into some of the margins that we're losing some of these rural communities by. And I feel like a lot of what the reason we lose them is not because we're not good for them, it's that they don't understand us. And we don't do a good enough job of making them understand us. Now, that said, there's a lot of propaganda telling them that we're bad people too. So, but what do you think? I mean, you still got a lot of ties in Sanford and Pittsburgh, as much as it's quickly becoming a suburb of more suburban community. What can we do to reach these people? What can we as Democrats do to try to make folks understand that we hear them?
Well, I think, Thomas, what's got to happen is twofold. One, and I really don't know another way to put it. One of the things is going to be our donors are going to have to recognize it's a problem and want to invest there. So I'll use as an example. I remember a big donor that we had who I adore. A really good person, really good hearted, really trying to do the right thing. And we had some seats out in the east we were trying to win. And that donor said, "Yeah, I'm not wasting money on that. We've lost the East, that's over." And, I'm looking at these candidates, and I'm looking at this polling, and I'm looking at what I get when I get on the ground in these areas. People don't know me, they have no idea who I am. I'm out here talking to people, and they're talking about these candidates. And so that went against what I thought in my mind. So that particular year, we lost those seats. Well, it's next cycle, same donor, same attitude. We're not wasting money, even though North Carolina's 80% rural. So I said, yeah, we can win these seats and we need to invest. And there was an amount of money I felt we invest this money, we get there. And that resulted in Dante Pittman. And Dante's been one of the best caucus members that we've had and somebody I think will be able to hold on to his seat. And we've got others that have been out there. And the problem is that we've become arrogant is what the problem is. And so that arrogance has led us to treat these same people in ways that that we accuse the Republicans of treating them. Like, I can't tell you how many times, well, in fact, I can't tell you how many times, 4 different times where I've talked to, either advocates, caucus members, or, folks in the donor class, whatever it is, that have explained to me what the problem is with black voters. And I'm not saying that just by being black that I know that, but what I'm saying is I'm not saying, "Hey, trust me, I'm black, so this is what's going on." I say, I am out here. I talk to people. These are the problems that they have. humor me. Let's just address these problems and see if they work. And then if it turns out what you think is wrong, I am happy to try those then. Same thing with young people. It is shocking how many times I hear people say, we just can't reach young people. And I go talk to young people and they're begging to be talked to. So what's got to happen with rural areas is we've got to get rid of our arrogance and believe maybe we don't know everything and our books and our universities didn't tell us everything about what people care about, and go talk to people. Take the criticisms. There are legitimate criticisms of us as a party in these rural areas. You can't think of first world problems. Some guy that's sitting here trying to figure out how he's going to pay the house note the first of the month can't think about what's happening to our democracy. He can't think about the fact that, for instance, as one person, that elected official put it, well, this person's a dictator, and so they ought to know they don't want dictators. What they know is democracy hasn't worked for them. They know they're still at $10 an hour. They know that there's still no development. They know that their community is actually dying. More people are dying than are being born in their community. People are moving out. So they want to address that. So we've got to learn to, when people tell us what they care about, believe them and listen to them. But then that also requires the money. And I didn't create this. I would love to have a moneyless system. I would love to have a system where you've actually got to go out there and earn your votes. You can't just depend on name this billionaire to fund the entire caucus and send out all this mail to tell people this guy's bad and my guy's good. I'd love to see that, but that's not where we live right now. So we've got to have the same dedication that they do in that sense. I mean, I can think of one, billionaire here in this state. There's not a universe. If Republicans lose power, that person, it will not be on that person's watch as far as they're concerned. They will spend money, ungodly amounts of money, to keep Republicans in power for whatever reason that they have. But you look on our side and you can have people who are billionaires that you can look and see that they've given $250, to candidates. And we've got to understand we didn't create the system. That's the system we're in. And the reason you need the money is because then that helps us spread that message throughout the East, throughout the Western counties, to be able to explain to people. For instance, I'd love to be able to go out West and say, you literally don't have money for recovery because your Congress people, you know, don't believe that there should be any pressure put on the president to give you money. Your
Right.
Congress people, your legislators don't believe there ought to be pressure put on their leaders to get money out there. But we can't tell them. So, these guys just go out there and they say, man, we'd love to give you some money, but the Democrats are stopping us, when there's literally not one Democrat on earth, and definitely no Democrat in this country, that can stop them from giving money to the folks out West. Right now, the West could be flush with money if the feds decided they were important, but their thing is they're going to vote for us anyway, so we don't need to give them money.
Right. So a lot of it is we've got to do a better job of outreach. I think Anderson Clayton, who I do a podcast with, Anderson's made a big deal about trying to reach out to rural North Carolina, and I admire that so much because, again,
Yes.
I grew up in Anson County. My joke about Anson County is it's half white, half black, and all poor, but and it's recovering a little bit, but that's not far from true. We lost the textile mills and lost our agriculture and everything. And I think it did kind of create a period of desperation in these counties that saw so much of their infrastructure go away,
Yeah.
you know, and I'm one who I have some beliefs that aren't exactly, you know, democratic dogma. I mean, I don't think the way Donald Trump's using tariffs is right, but I also don't think the free trade stuff is nearly as glory a great thing as people are trying to say it is. At least it wasn't if you were living in those communities, if you had spent your life working in industries that went away,
Amen.
not slowly, they went away in a blink of
Mhm.
an eye. And I
Amen.
just I see these people say, well, it wasn't really trade that sent those jobs away. It was technology. Those jobs were going to go away anyhow. I lived in Cleveland County from 1993 to 1996. And when I got down there, I was working in Rutherford County and I was living in Cleveland County. And they were saying this region is recession proof. And I said, "How do you figure?" And they said, "Well, we're manufacturing transmissions down here. We've got CDs over here. We have this plastic injection molding. We're building jaws. We have jaws of life, which was pulling out of wrecks. The jaws of life would open up cars that were in wrecks to get people out. They said, we've got tons of textile mills, and they had this really low unemployment, totally manufacturing based economy, but a whole bunch of different manufacturing, not just one group or another. And they thought this is going to sustain us regardless of what happens. And by 2000, Rutherford County had among the highest unemployment in the state. It was like 17%. And it was persistent. It
Hmm.
stayed there. And that wasn't because of technology. That was there because of trade. And I worked in an aluminum die casting plant for a little bit. And I knew some of those people. And the heartbreaking thing was to hear people who were working for Cone Mills, for instance, going down to South America and training the people who were going to take their jobs how to use those machines. They came back, they went down there to train the people, came back and knew they were gonna be unemployed. So anyhow, I think there are trade is a difficult thing. I don't know how I'm sorry I got off on that tangent, but I do feel like we need to be attentive to the reason a lot of the resentments are there are policies that both parties pushed. And what you've left is there are people my age that I tell a story. One guy I knew I grew up with, he started life in a textile mill and he had a good job, and he started having kids early, probably, 19, 20. By the mid 90s, he had lost his job at the textile mill closed. He's got a family and kids, and he went into the construction trade. Quickly, the construction trade shifted mainly because they started hiring migrant work to do the building, and he was driving to Charlotte at that time, and about 15 years ago, I ran into him, and he was driving cars. He was at a car dealership. He was driving cars down to for people who were getting their car service on. He was driving them back and forth to work. So this is a guy who started his life at thinking he had his life kind of planned out, working in a textile mill, working his way up. As soon as he starts working his way up, he loses that job. He goes into construction, and that construction industry basically lost it. By the time he's 50 something years old, he's making less money with less benefits than he was in his 20s. That's a terrible story, and that's all too common in a lot of rural North Carolina, and we need to recognize that and understand that that's where a lot of these resentments come from,
Right.
and they're things we need to hear these people. Now, I'm sure that guy's a probably, an avid Trumper would be my guess, but it's hard
Hmm.
to blame him if he wants to burn everything down because they burned everything of his down, you know, and
And I'm
that's
telling you, Thomas, what you just said, that story right there is where for me, the frustration comes with the arrogance of some of our folks. Because the arrogance is, well, you ought to be happy because we're trying to create, a better or a different world. And they don't understand that's the world he was comfortable in and was happy. He was happy. He was moving. He knew he had opportunities that fit what he wanted to do. Everybody don't want to be a college professor. Everybody don't want to be, all these other things. I can't tell you what your story of Anson is the story of Siler City. Yeah, you're talking about had everything in the world going. You had, textile manufacturing, you had the chicken plants, all that stuff. And so you knew I can get out of high school, I can get here, work this job. If I work hard, I can reach this position on this, make a very comfortable living. And with the low cost of living, buy a really nice home, really nice house, live in a really nice neighborhood, go to a good church, good family, and be able to provide for my kids and send them to school. Like one of the most unsung facts about places like we grew up or how many people like my grandfather I would use who worked at our brickyard for 50 years, 50. And he sent
Right.
6 kids, 5 of his own, 1 he adopted, 6 children to college, had a chance to go to college. And that meant the world to him. And then to be able to see his grandson, me be able to get raised by my parents, who were able to work local jobs. My father was working at Pfizer, my mother was working at what became Duke Energy, CP&L at the time, and they were able to send me to college and to grad school so I could go to law school and then come home and be an attorney. And he knew that I was going to work and try to advance. All of these things provided people an opportunity to advance in the way that they wanted to. But it's funny, and we do it in 2 different ways. Some of our folks who I think have lived in a bubble, they all believe you should aspire to the trust account life. You should aspire to, be in the executive or something like that. And those on the, Republican side right now are scared that's what you want and that you'll do anything to get it, including, take from them. But they're both doing the same thing. They're not allowing for people who just said, I don't want to live in New York. I don't want to live in Raleigh. I don't want to live in Charlotte. I want to live the life I want right here, and I will be happy as I can be. And I just want to make sure that my family can do better than I did and leave them something and to leave a mark. Think of how many of those folks that you're talking about that would, when it was still there, that manufacturing allowed them to. My dad worked in HR at Pfizer. You know how much it meant to him to suddenly be able to have all of these African American people who never had a chance to work those jobs suddenly could come flying in, and they knew they had somebody who could get them hired, get them in. And there's so many of them that were able to retire from Cody and just do better, and it just, that's what they want. And we've got to go back and listen. We've got to talk, and we've got to accept that there's nothing wrong with what they like. I mean, heck, I love that life. After a lot
Yeah.
of times I would love, to be away from a lot of this stuff and just be able to help people in that way. But that's not the society we've created, and we've got to accept that for 80% of North Carolina, that's the only thing that they're going to have until, the world changes a little bit more in a positive way.
Right. Well, Robert, this has been a great conversation, and I appreciate you taking time to be with me. We went a little bit longer than I'd planned. I hope that's okay with your time. But
That's fine, man.
we'll get back together and we'll do it again soon. All right. Again, thank
Sounds
you for
good,
being
Tom.
here.
Take care of yourself.
All right.
Thanks,
This is
man.
Thomas Mills signing off for Politics NC.